Well, good evening and welcome back to session 5 of Unleashing the Old Testament, survey course of the Old Testament. Whether you're coming to us from across Canada, the UK, Denmark, Australia, Egypt, I want to say good evening, or maybe it's more appropriate to say good morning. I'm coming to you from my living room, and we would love for people to get a little flavor of people's personality. So right now, as I'm just giving the intro, why don't you write in the chat box your favorite drink of choice? I'm drinking from a teacup, but it's coffee. I'm drinking from a teacup, but it's coffee. Why don't you let us know your drink of choice? Do you drink coffee? Do you drink tea? Do you like something cold? Do you like something that like starts off hot and then becomes more cold, like lukewarm temperature, hot chocolate, whatever it is? Why don't you put that and include what city you're asking questions or you're commenting from? That's in the chat box at any point tonight when my dad's speaking, even right now as I'm giving the intro. Feel free to ask your questions, but not in the chat box. Ask it through the Q&A box. And when you do ask questions, please feel free to say where you're asking from. It just adds a little more personality as we're all online, and we'd love to connect with you. Well, without further ado, please welcome my dad. He's going to be speaking to us, taking us through tonight, and I believe in the coming a few nights, he's going to be taking us through some of the first 5 books of the Old Testament, continuing that. And those can be some of the most challenging books to read on our own. And so it's going to help bring those books alive for us. I'm really excited to learn from him. Please welcome my dad, Alan Gilman.
Well, again, thank you, Daniel, and hello, everyone. It's good to be back here. It's nice to see each week so many people joining in the in this live presentation, and I've been also checking out the views on YouTube, and several of maybe you're watching them again, or other people are. I know other people are watching this afterwards because of scheduling reasons. I'm so glad that we have this kind of technology to do this sort of thing, and especially in the situation we find ourselves in at this time. Excuse me. And so, as Daniel said, we're going to be continuing in the books of Moses, and particularly, we're going to be focusing over the next few weeks on the second through fifth books of the books of Moses. And so, I'll bring up the slides. All right. Okay, so this is session 5, and as I said, we're continuing the Torah, and we're going to be learning over the next couple of weeks. The Torah means more than one thing. So there's the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, and then there's the Torah, the revelation of God's ways that's contained in the Torah. Sounds confusing. Hopefully, by the end of next session, this will be very clear. You're all going to be experts on this. And so we've been looking at the book of Genesis, and now we're continuing in the next 4 books, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so here's how we're going to be going about this evening. We're going to start with a book overview. We'll look at each of the 4 books and do a very quick what's in each book. Then we're going to look at the storyline of the 4 books. Sorry, I'm having a little bit of trouble here. Take a drink. Thank you. Yes, we'll do the storyline of the 4 books. Then we're going to look at some key themes that are found in these 4 books. And one of those themes is the Sinai covenant, the covenant that God gave to the people of Israel through Moses at Mount Sinai. So that is one of the themes, but we're going to spend longer on that one than the others. In fact, it's going to take us through to the next 3 sessions following. Next week, we're going to be looking at, is the Torah or the law for today? That's examining the relevancy of the books of Moses to our day today. And this is very controversial. There's a lot of confusion with regard to this, but my hope and my prayer is that you're going to discover how foundational the Torah is, especially that which is contained in the books of Moses, for for us today. In fact, God's revelation of his truth and of his ways through the books of Moses are the foundation of the entire Bible. When we get into the books that come after that and start to look at Joshua, Judges, First and Second Samuel, First and Second Kings, often these are called the historical books because there's a lot of historical stories there. In Jewish tradition, they're called the former prophets, as opposed to the latter prophets, which are the writing prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and so on. So the earlier books that are often referred to as historical are actually they're they reflect the truth of the books of Moses. And we see how God blesses those who follow in his ways and curses those who don't. And there are so many allusions and reflections in those books to what God gives the people of Israel at Mount Sinai. The latter prophets, or the writing prophets, much of what they are saying is calling the people back to the truth of Torah. Yes, there are predictions, we call them prophecies. Some of them specifically refer to the coming of the Messiah, and that is so very important. But even the anticipation of the coming of the Messiah is all rooted in what God says in the books of Moses. Again, we're going to talk about that more next time. And so the whole Bible is built on the foundation of the books of Moses and even the New Testament. The New Testament then is a culmination, or we've talked about this word fulfillment before. The way the New Testament fulfills the Hebrew scriptures is not replacing them. It's not giving an alternative to it. It's actually bringing everything that God reveals in these earlier writings to the full. As I said, much of this we're going to talk more next week. Next week is a very important session because of the controversial nature and the confusion of this issue. Is the Torah for today? Continuing on with these four books of Moses, we're going to spend a session talking about the feasts. My experience is most readers of the Bible actually don't know that much about the feasts. There are others that emphasize the feasts very, very much and believe that all followers of Jesus should be keeping the feasts today and all the rest. And we're going to talk about all that. We're going to discover some of the meaning of the feasts. We're going to see how they apply to us today. And then we're going to spend some time looking at the sacrificial system because it's core to these core writings. And so, the sacrificial system is an aspect of how the covenant God gave to the people of Israel is maintained, and as well as provides for us understanding about both ourselves and about God. And the sacrificial system is like everything else we encounter in the books of Moses. It's there to reflect God, reflect his truth, and help us to understand who we are and how we are to relate to the Creator God. So that's our outline. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the first 4 points and beginning that fourth point, the Sinai covenant, that we then continue in the next few weeks. So now what we're going to do is a book overview, very, very, very brief. What are these 4 books about? Well, first of all, the book of Exodus, the second book of the Torah, second book of the Bible, is a story of the people of Israel in bondage, in slavery in Egypt, their rescue, and the giving of the covenant to them by Moses, by God through Moses at Mount Sinai. Then the book of Leviticus is instructions for priests. And I know a lot of people have trouble relating to Leviticus. Hopefully we'll be able to help with that, especially as we get into the sacrificial system in a few weeks. The book of Numbers begins with a census. That's why it's called in English Numbers. Interesting, in Hebrew, it's called B'midbar, in the wilderness. Because after we get through all the lists of names, the genealogies in the list of names, and so more list of names in Numbers, the counting of the people, We we follow the people of Israel in their wilderness wanderings. Then the book of Deuteronomy is the reiteration of the covenant, and much it actually repeats in similar but other words much of what God revealed to the people of Israel through Moses on Mount Sinai, and then it's expanded upon, and it is the reiteration of the contents of the covenant for the new generation of Israelites after the people had wandered through the wilderness for 40 years before they enter the promised land. So those, in a nutshell, are that is the contents of the four books. Now, let's take a little journey of the storyline through these four books. So this is, we call this the narrative. This is the story as it goes through it. I'm not covering every single event, but hitting some of the main ones just to give an overview of the story as it happens, beginning in the book of Exodus through the book of Deuteronomy. So beginning with Exodus, we see that Israel's enslaved in Egypt. They got there because of these unusual circumstances that led them there when Joseph's brothers, and I didn't spend time on this last time, so I'll say this briefly, especially for those who are unfamiliar with this story. We talked about Jacob. Jacob ended up having 12 sons because Jacob's name was changed to Israel. The 12 sons were the sons of Israel, and each of them were the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. But before they became that large, the Joseph was favored both by God and by his father, and he actually had some dreams that seemed to suggest that he would rule over his family one day. Well, he had done some other things that angered his brothers. They were jealous of him, and they wanted to get rid of him. Actually, some of them wanted to kill him. Eventually, they sold him into slavery. He ends up in Egypt for a long time, and God used that to eventually use Joseph to interpret the dreams of the Egyptian king, whose title was Pharaoh, and reveal to Pharaoh from God that there would be these years of plenty followed by years of famine. And then Joseph was appointed as second command in Egypt to administer the food to prepare for the years of famine. And it was during that time, through another whole set of circumstances, that his family ended up moving to Egypt. And those beginning years were great for the people of Israel. Eventually, a new Pharaoh arises, likely a new dynasty, who didn't care for the history of Joseph and what happened through him and his family. And he begins to oppress the people of Israel. By this time, they're great in number, and he's worried that one day they might join Egypt's enemies in a battle. And so he decides to oppress them by making them slaves. They begin to build cities for Pharaoh. And that's how the book of Exodus begins, with Israel enslaved. Eventually, things go from bad to worse, and Pharaoh decrees that all the Hebrew baby boys, and at that time the word Hebrew is used more than Israelite. We talked about this, I think, the first session. Today we use the word Jewish. In the Bible, we have sometimes Hebrew, most of the time Israelite. Here it's usually Hebrew. So Pharaoh decrees that Hebrew baby boys were to be thrown into the Nile River. And in the midst of that horrendous decree, Moses is born. And Moses has this very unusual coming into the world. We're going to be looking at him a little more closely in a few minutes. But Moses was protected by his parents for a while. There's a hint in the way it's written that they thought there was something special about him. And when they saw that they couldn't hide him much longer, they put him in a sealed basket into the Nile. It's hard to know if they were hoping that he would be rescued or what, but all we know is what actually happened. And the daughter of Pharaoh found him and ends up paying Moses' mother to nurse him. So after they gave Moses up, they get him back for a while, and now she's even being paid to take care of her own child, who ends up being raised in Pharaoh's household. and I should have had this up. So Moses is rescued and adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. And then as he grows up, somehow he knows he is a Hebrew or an Israelite. We are not told how. If you've seen The Prince of Egypt, the famous animated version of the story, that's not how it happens. He does not hear his sister Miriam. He had a sister Miriam. He did not hear his sister Miriam humming the tune that his mother used to hum to him when he was a baby. And all of a sudden he starts to get these flashbacks. We don't know how Moses knew. It sounds as if he just knew, and he had a burden for his own people, and he thought he would try to help them, but instead he ends up murdering an Egyptian and ends up becoming a fugitive. He hears that Pharaoh is now out to get him, and so he escapes to the wilderness for 40 years. And he's a shepherd. He meets a man from the people of Midian, and he marries this man Jethro's daughter, and has a family of his own, and becomes a shepherd in the very wilderness that he will be leading his own people through. But he doesn't know that yet, of course. And so one day he sees a strange sight. He sees a bush that is burning but isn't burning up. And that's where God calls Moses from the burning bush and basically said, well, Moses, now the thing that you always wanted to do, now you're going to get to do it. And Moses basically argues with God, and he objects to this assignment in 6 different ways. And God answers his objections. You could read that for yourself. And it's interesting. Moses never actually says, okay. God just has his way with Moses, and Moses goes. And it's one of the incredible things about Moses. Here's Moses. He had a burden for his people. He got himself into trouble. He didn't want to do it when God finally called him, but for the most part, he does a magnificent job doing it was an impossible job that he did amazingly. Maybe that's how I should say it. All right, so it continues on with Moses. He goes with his brother Aaron, and first of all, they share the good news with the elders of Israel that God has heard their cry for help, and they're here to help, and they're happy. And so then Moses and Aaron go and confront Pharaoh. Pharaoh's not happy. In fact, Pharaoh makes the labor of the Hebrews even harder and makes them produce more in less time. That's the fastest, easiest way to say it. And the people, these same elders who were so encouraged that God had come to save them and was having compassion on them, now they're blaming Moses for making things worse for them. It's at that point when Moses goes to God and says, this has gone from bad to worse, and God tells him, you ain't seen nothing yet. Now I'm going to show my power. And he strikes Egypt with 10 plagues. The word for plague means strike. So God hits them with these horrific things, turning the Nile River to blood, a plague of frogs, various diseases, hail and fire, and so on. And each time is a little different. Sometimes nothing happens in between, but quite often Pharaoh says, okay, kind of like, uncle, I'll do this thing. And then Moses prays and God stops the plague. And then Pharaoh changes his mind again. And that goes on until the 10th plague, which is the killing of the firstborn. And we're going to look at that in more detail in a bit. I say that a lot, don't I? Then, so Israel now is able to leave Egypt, and they're guided by a pillar of cloud and fire. It looks like a cloud during the day and fire at night. And this is what God uses to lead them on their journey. And it seems also to be, it acts as some sort of protective covering for them. And there's a sense in which God's presence is in this manifestation of this cloud and fire. So they begin that journey and they end up stuck at the sea, and there's discussion whether it is the Red Sea that we're aware of or a smaller body of water called the Sea of Reeds. Either way, the story is well, I'd say overwhelmingly wonderful. It's overwhelming. It was probably more overwhelming for the Egyptians who died being drowned in the sea. However, it is, God does this incredible miracle for them with the crossing of the Red Sea, where it's very interesting in that story how the people are, if I may say, and it's hard to know. I don't know all the people who are watching this, but some of my lingo, I don't know often how people take it, but the people were freaked out because they got the sea in front of them. They can't do anything about that. And the Egyptian army is hot on their tail from behind. And Moses says, stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. And God says, why are you all crying to me? Go forward. And here's Moses. He thought he was really in sync with what God was doing and wanted to do. And it would make sense. Like he'd never seen a sea split before. And he thought, well, God's just going to come through like with the 10 plagues and just kind of wall up the Egyptians. But no, we're not doing it that way. And that's something we got to learn. We really need to learn how God doesn't always do the same thing twice. And even with the set of the plagues, they're all different. But even that approach, that was for that period. Now we're going to deal with the sea and the Egyptian army. We're going to do something different. And it causes God's people to continue to look to him and not look to simply how he's always done things in the past. And so God says, "Go forward," and Moses raises his staff over on the sea bank, I guess you'd call it. And this wind comes, separates the sea, and the people of Israel, 2 million strong, cross on dry ground. And I would probably do what Pharaoh did. We don't know if Pharaoh went in. It doesn't look like it, but he sent his army to follow them and think if that's the thing to do, right? And then the people of Israel on their other side, and God brings the sea on top of the Egyptian army, and that's the final end of the Egyptian threat. And then it's the beginning of more adventures. So early on, as they are now in the wilderness, and wilderness is it's rocky, it's dry. It's not like the Sahara Desert. There'd be the odd oasis that would be lush. There'd be little bits of green here and there. Water would be hard to find. They couldn't grow food. And so what God does is he provides the people with this strange substance that becomes known as manna. Manna is from the Hebrew word ma, and ma means what. And so we read, they basically said, what is it? And it got nicknamed, kind of, it's like, it's what stuff. It's that kind of idea. And God provides the people of Israel with enough manna per each family for the 40 years they were in the wilderness until they crossed into the promised land 40 years later. And the manna was quite remarkable in that there was always enough for every day. But on the 6th day of the week, what we now call Friday, they were to take double the amount because there wouldn't be any on the 7th day, Shabbat, the Sabbath. And what was really amazing about that, on the other days, if they ever collected more than enough manna per family, then it would go bad the next day. Except on the 6th day, it would last the extra day, so they would have the manna on Shabbat. Early on, they're attacked by another nation called Amalek, and they're defeated. And it's an early victory for a former slave nation that's learning to be the people of God. Moses leads them to the mountain where he encountered God with the burning bush, and that's where the covenant is given, the 10 words and so on. The 10 words are the 10 commandments. In Hebrew, they're called the 10 words. They're not called the 10 commandments. It came into English that way eventually, but they're actually called the 10 words. Moses gets this revelation of God's word from him, and the people, and he's up there for 40 days. There's this constant reference to 40 days, and they're getting impatient, and so they commit this sin. With Aaron's help, they fashion a cow, a golden calf, and they basically have some sort of ritualistic orgies from what we could tell. And Moses comes down and sees what's going on. God had already warned him, and he smashes the 2 tablets of the 10 words. Following that, there's a whole interaction between Moses and God, where Moses pleads on behalf of the people, and God has mercy on the nation despite their horrific sin with the calf. Uh, then God rewrites the 10 words. So God actually wrote what we call the 10 commandments on 2 tablets, front and back. It's not like the pictures you often see where they're just written on the front and back. And he wrote them personally himself with his finger, the scripture says. And he did it twice, not just once. Then we see the latter part of the book of Exodus is the construction of what in Hebrew called the Mishkan, which means dwelling place. In English, we use tabernacle, and it's the precursor of the temple that would be built by David's son Solomon later on. And this is the institution of the sacrificial system. That brings us to the end of the book of Exodus. Now we get to the third book of the Torah, Leviticus. And as far as the storyline is concerned, all we have is the death of Aaron's sons. They brought fire before the Lord that was unauthorized, whatever that really means, and they died. This is after the tabernacle was built and the glory of God fills it. But most of the book of Leviticus are priestly rules, and there is not a lot of story. So now let's go on to the book of Numbers. As I mentioned, it begins with a census, and then Israel sets out from Mount Sinai in anticipation of entering the promised land. They get to the they get to the border of the promised land. They send in some spies, 12, call them scouts, whatever word you want to use. There was 12 of them, and they came back. They all agreed that that the land was great, just like God said. They all agreed that there were very powerful people populating the land, but where 10 disagreed with 2, the 10 said, we can't do this. Doesn't matter what God says, we can't do it. The other 2, Caleb and Joshua, said, yes, with God's help, we can. He said we could. We've already seen him help us. We can do this. But the people's hearts were taken by the report of the 10, and they began to complain and actually said it would be better to go back to Egypt. And so they failed to go into the promised land, and God decrees that they should wander for 38 more years. Here's where we don't have time to get in all the various things that happen, the different stories that occur during their wilderness wanderings. But eventually there's a situation where Moses' anger gets the better of him. We see that he has he has an anger issue. He had murdered a man back in Egypt. He did so well for so long, but the people finally got to him, and he acted out of anger, it appears, and he did something in a way that God did not want him to do. And as a result, God said that he would not be allowed to enter the promised land. This was not a rejection of Moses. It was simply he could not go in. He was allowed to go up on a high hill and see the land, but he was not allowed to lead the people in. This is something that his successor, Joshua, would do. Before Moses himself dies, his brother Aaron dies. Then there's this very important battle with these 2 kings, Sihon and Og. And it's really important because these battles become a reference point later on when the people of Israel have to go into the promised land. It's often said, just like you defeated these kings, so you will defeat the peoples in the land. And so things were difficult, but things were going pretty well. There is this incident. It's a horrible incident of Balak and Balaam, where this king, Balak, saw what happened with these other kings and their peoples, and he figured he's got to do something so that he doesn't get overwhelmed by the people of Israel. And so he hires a sorcerer or soothsayer named Balaam to come and curse the people. And every time he goes to curse them, blessing comes out of his mouth. And theologians love to get into this. Was Balaam a true prophet or not? But God eventually confronts him and speaks great things through Balaam. What a lot of people don't realize is then Balaam later on, or actually soon after, arranges for these women from this place Peor to seduce the Israelite men. And so what couldn't be accomplished through sorcery was accomplished through sexual sin. And there's something actually very instructive about that. We go on to the book of Deuteronomy, and there, as I've already mentioned, the covenant is reiterated by Moses. There's the second census after the adult generation that failed to go into the promised land. They all die out, and so there's a new generation, and so there's a second census. Joshua is appointed as Moses' successor. This is before Moses dies. And one of the things about Joshua and this whole thing with Moses is think about the people of Israel and the place Moses had in the nation up to this point, and the kind of leader that he was. And then he's removed more or less at the last minute before the climax of entering into the land and finally possessing what had been promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's not going to be Moses. It's going to be Joshua. And this is one of the many ways God reminds his people, reminds us, not to depend on leaders, not to depend on the people that we're following, but always to depend on him. And God can use whomever he wants, whenever he wants. And then Moses dies, and that closes the books of Moses. Do remember to put any questions you have in the Q&A box or send it to me by email. Really appreciated, whether it's the live questions, some of the questions I answer later. And I hope, I know people have been appreciating that. And then I've been getting some questions directly by email, which have been great. And I hope I've been of help. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at some key themes of these 4 books of Moses. So we're going to, here are the key themes. And there's more, but these are the ones I've chosen. Rescue from bondage. We're going to look a little more closely at Moses. The revelation of God, which is not, which I'm not talking about that which God reveals to us about life and that sort of thing, but that God is revealed through the books of Moses. We'll look at the Passover. It's one of the most important events in the entire Bible. Dependency upon God and what we learn about that in the books of Moses. Faith, which I prefer to use the word trust, because that's what faith means. And again, it's another important theme in these books. And then the Sinai covenant. And we're going to start by looking at some elements of the Sinai covenant in this session. But as I said, we're going to be looking at other things in the next few weeks. The first one being next week, and has to do with how what was revealed through the Sinai covenant is relevant for today. Is it relevant for today? If it is, how? So here's our first key theme, rescue from bondage. I'm reading Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 through 8. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt and have heard their cry because of their taskmasters. I know their sufferings and have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. One of the things I love about this is how God says, I have come down. Now, people could get into like how this works physically, metaphysically, about God being in heaven and God coming down to earth. But it's the heart of what he's saying here. I think I just shouted. I didn't mean to shout. It's the heart of what he's saying here, that God taking pity upon his people and coming down to be among them, to do what is needed to deliver them from this bondage. Now, something I want to point out is taking us all the way back to the promise to Abraham. Actually, we started with creation, and we saw due to the first human beings' disobedience to God, God cursed not only the human family, but the creation. There's a hint of that being confronted by God, by someone who would come to crush the serpent's head. But it's not until the calling of Abram, whose name was later changed to Abraham, that we see the promise, through you all the nations of the world will be blessed. And I explained how that promise, which Paul calls the gospel in Galatians chapter 3, verse 8, is more than one day God will enable us to have a personal relationship with him. It's actually the confrontation of the curse. God called Abraham, through whom to create a nation, through whom the curse would be confronted and God would restore all things. That's what the Bible's all about. But interestingly, the people that he called, through whom he would implement the solution, so the people that he called to be that blessing, the instruments of the blessing that would confront the curse, the people that he called to be part of the solution are themselves part of the problem. So there's like, unlike the superhero motif that's so popular in our day, where you have people that are more or less detached from human experience, and they come in with so different from the rest, and they save the day. God created a situation where he, through his people, enters into the problem. And the people who are part of the solution themselves are suffering under the problem. Even God himself in the Messiah suffers under the problem. And that's how he brings about the solution. And so here, Israel was called originally, hundreds of years before, beginning with Abram, to be the solution, and now they're stuck because of the problem of what the Bible calls sin. In this case, it's the evil oppression of this foreign ruler who is treating them like worse than animals in order to build up his own security. It's simple. It's a like a reflection of the Babel stories. That same sort of spirit again, being expressed by Pharaoh, and he's doing it on the backs of the people of Israel. But God had promised that he would rescue them, and now he's come to rescue them. And that act of rescue is a picture of God's rescue of all people that we can all experience through the Messiah, Jesus. Now we're going to go back and we're going to look at Moses. I'm going to go over this pretty quickly as we look at the story of Moses' own life. I referred to some of this already, but I'm providing here some of the scripture references, and you'll get all these when I post the slides by tomorrow. All right, so he starts off with unusual birth circumstances. We talked about that already. In a time when all the babies were being killed, he's hidden for a while, put into in the Nile, discovered by Pharaoh's daughter, nursed by his own mother for pay, and he's raised in the house of Pharaoh. He ends up mishandling the cause. He sees something's wrong. He wants to help his people. He doesn't handle it well, ends up murdering a man. So then he ends up in the wilderness, and he's there for 40 years. Eventually, God calls him. And as I mentioned, Moses resists that call, but he ends up going anyway. Then what we see in the rest of the story, beginning with Exodus 4, verse 18, Moses' incredible leadership and faithfulness to God. And this is summed up through Moses' humility. Numbers 12, verse 3, we read, "Now the man Moses was very meek, more than all the people who were on the face of the earth." What a thing to say about anyone. And if Moses actually penned it, do you realize how humble, and the word meek means humble, how humble can a person be to be able to write how humble they are? And I know we can get really humorous about this, but let's move on. Moses' humility is mainly seen in how every time he hits an obstacle, he goes back to God. He goes back to God. And he faced so much pressure. There was the circumstances that they were all struggling with. And then he also had the whining and the complaining of the people. You read it, it almost sounds like it's constant. And yet, every time he would have a problem with the people, other leaders, a situation, he'd go back to God. He'd go back to God. God would tell him what to do. He would speak it. He would do it. And that's the true essence of humility, a human heart that is submitted to God, not in some kind of just simple pious, like religious, ritualistic sense. It's in a heart that is willing to do whatever God tells them to do. That was Moses, except for that one time he messed up when he hit the rock instead of speaking to it in the way that he was supposed to. Well, Moses had a unique relationship with God. We see this in Numbers 12, verses 6 through 8. I'll read that. And he said, this is God speaking, and it's in a situation where people were complaining about Moses as Moses the leader. Hear my words, says the Lord. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, make myself known to him in a vision. I speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak mouth to mouth, clearly and not in riddles, and he beholds the form of the Lord, whatever that is. Why then were you not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? And God saying Moses is different. Moses is special. There are other prophets, there will be other prophets, but Moses is, God speaks to him like he speaks to a friend. So Moses is set apart from all. So up until the coming of Jesus, there was no one ever like Moses. And yet, like the rest of us, Moses failed in Numbers 20, verses 1 through 13, where his anger gets the better of him. All right, that's Moses. Next, another key theme, the revelation of God himself. This is, as I said, this is God revealing himself to the people of Israel and through the people of Israel to the world. Exodus 3, verses 13 and 14. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people, this is when he's having this, call it argument with God, when God's telling him to go to Egypt, and Moses objects. And one of the objections is this one. So Moses says to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers, I'm going too fast again, I'll try to slow down. The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And so this is just the beginning of God making himself known through Moses to the people of Israel. And we have a record of that in Scripture. And so God calls Moses, rescues the people of Israel, and one of the reasons for that is to show us who he is, his character. What does he love? What does he hate? What does he do? What does he not do? What does he expect of people? And so on. The revelation of God given to the people of Israel through Moses and through their experience in these books. Another key theme, the Passover. So many of us are familiar. This has to do with the 10th plague. I mentioned it already. When Pharaoh had been so stubborn after the 9 plagues, God said that he would kill all the firstborn in Egypt. Now, it's interesting because there's a lot that's interesting. There were other plagues. Well, some of the plagues affected everyone. Some of the plagues only affect the Egyptians. The darkness, and I guess you'd have to be there to fully get it. The 9th plague, there was darkness throughout the land of Egypt, but there was light in the homes of the Israelites. The Passover seems to be a plague that differentiates the people of Israel from the Egyptians, but they still had to do something. And so God had decreed that this angel of death would come and kill all the firstborn of people and animals. And God says in Exodus 12, verses 12 to 13, for I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you. That's where the term Passover comes from. I will pass over you, and no plague will befall you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So people of Israel had to do this. They had to take in a lamb for a few days into their home, and then they would slay that lamb and take the blood, and they would put it on the top of it's called the lintel of the door frame, the top of the door frame, and the 2 sides. And when God, through this angel, would see this blood upon the door frames of the Israelite homes, he would pass over that house. And of course, this is an incredible foreshadowing of the coming of the Messiah and how his shed blood, if we apply his shed blood to our lives, then judgment passes over us. But this event is core of all that God will do. It's continually referenced in the pages of the Old Testament, and it's key in understanding who God is and what he has done and is doing for his people. Next, dependency upon God as another key theme. Deuteronomy 8, verse 3, referring to Moses is retelling the story of their experiences in the wilderness since leaving Egypt. Remember, it's about 40 years later. He's going to be dying soon. Joshua will lead them into the land, and he's retelling the story. He's going to reiterate the specifics of the covenant. And he says this, and he humbled you, that is, God humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know. What is it? Nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. And so Moses is saying here that there was a purpose to this experience of not having food and being hungry in the wilderness, and God providing this miraculous food called manna and having to rely on him upon that every day, that they needed to learn to depend on God for everything. So sometimes when people quote this, man lives by every, man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Often we think what this means is we don't live only by bread, but also by God's word. But that's not what this says. This says there's two kinds of living. Bread alone living, which is what most of us do most of the time, where we're driven by our appetites, whether it's literal food or our bodily desires. That's bread alone living. The other way to live, and the way the people of Israel needed to learn to live, and the way that we need to learn to live, is by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. When you do that, then your true bodily needs do get met. But then we're living based on a dependency upon God, and we're not sidetracked, distracted, and confused by our own appetites. Rather, we are being led by the word of the Lord. And notice, not doing this is the essence of Adam and Eve's original failure. God gave them his word, and instead of relying or depending upon him and his word, they relied on their own senses and their own desires, and got them and everything else into trouble. And what God is doing through his work in the people of Israel, rescuing them from Egypt and leading them through the wilderness and so on, is he's working to undo that which Adam and Eve did. Next, faith, similar to dependency upon him, because it is trust. Numbers 14, 26 through 30. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, saying, how long will this wicked congregation grumble against me? I've heard the grumblings of the people of Israel, which they grumble against me. And by the way, this is God speaking to them after they complained about being too afraid to enter the promised land, even though he said they should. And two of the scouts told them that they will be able to with God's help. So say to them, as I live, declares the Lord, what you said in my hearing I will do to you. Your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and of all your number listed in the census from 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me, not one shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh and Joshua the son of Nun. These were the two scouts that said, we can do this. Unbelief, lack of trust in God, will always get us into trouble. And it will get the people near to us in trouble. God was seeking to train the people of Israel to depend on him, to trust in him. And if they would do so, then things would go well. If they didn't, they'd get into big trouble. It was true then, and it's still true today. This brings us to the next key theme, the Sinai covenant. And as I mentioned, we're going to be continuing this for the next few weeks. So as part of outline of what we're going to be doing tonight still, I think I can squeeze this in before we're done. We're going to be looking at the objects of the Sinai covenant, the basis of the Sinai covenant. We're going to see how it's a revelation of God's ways. Remember, I mentioned how these books of Moses reveal God. Well, through the Sinai covenant and its contents, God's ways are revealed to us. We're going to see the conditions of the covenant. We're going to see how it anticipates failure and how it also anticipates restoration. So here we go. See, I'm going to try to get this all in before we stop. I might have to go a little bit past the top of the hour to do that. So here we go. The objects of the Sinai covenant. The Sinai covenant is specific to the people of Israel. Exodus 20, verses 1 to 3. This is the beginning of the 10 words, the 10 commandments. And God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. So the covenant is given to, and the specifics of the covenant are all to do with the people who were rescued from the land of Egypt. It's the people who were in bondage to Pharaoh in Egypt that were rescued through Moses and his brother Aaron, that were brought to Mount Sinai. They are the ones who are the object of the covenant. That might seem obvious to many of you, but as we go along, you'll see why this is really important, and we'll deal with it more next time. And these objects of the covenant are Abraham's descendants through Isaac and Jacob. Exodus 2:24 is when a comment about God beginning to act on behalf of his suffering people. And God heard their groaning and remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. And so the giving of the Sinai covenant, that's the result of the rescue from Egypt, is all on the basis of the earlier promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants. Next, the basis of the covenant. The basis of the covenant is God's deliverance of the people. Exodus 22 and 3. I am the Lord your God. I read this already. Who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You have no other gods before me, etc. So God, in a sense, bought the Israel, who were slaves, that he redeemed them. And redeem has to do with trading something in order to release something else. And I won't go into more detail now because of the time. And so God, in a sense, paid for the release of the people. And now they went from being the slaves of Pharaoh to the servants of God. And so he has, in a sense, this right to make the demands of the covenant upon them because he was their rescuer. Next, the Sinai covenant is the revelation of God's ways, or Torah. Torah means teaching or direction. We're going to talk about it more next time. It's usually translated law, and there's a reason for that. I'll also explain that next time. But let's look at this revelation of God's ways, Leviticus 18, verses 1 to 5. And the Lord said to Moses, saying, speak to the people of Israel and say to them, I am the Lord your God. You shall not do as they do in the land of Egypt where you lived, and you shall not do as they do in the land of Canaan, to which I'm bringing you. You shall not walk in their statutes. You shall follow my rules and keep my statutes and walk in them. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my rules. If a person does them, he shall live by them. I am the Lord. A little thing that we're going to deal with more next time. There's a tendency to think that somehow if the people of Israel would simply behave and act like good little boys and girls and do everything they're supposed to, then God's going to make everything good for them. That's not really what they're saying here. It's far more practical than that. God gives the people of Israel life-giving ways of living. And if they adhere to this way of living, as opposed to the ways of living of the surrounding peoples or the peoples that were currently in the land of Canaan, the promised land, if they lived by their ways, they would have terrible lives, as opposed to the good lives they would have if they would follow in the ways of God. Something else that's really important in understanding how God has revealed his ways through the books of Moses is this sentence in Deuteronomy chapter 29, verse 29. It's one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things that are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we might do all the words of this law, or which is Torah, his teaching. And so this tells us God reveals that which his people need to know in order to live effective godly lives. The things that he has not revealed, those are the secret things. People often call them mysteries, but those are not mysteries. It's because when we talk about mysteries, which is that there's a New Testament concept of mystery. I won't go into that right now. But people talk about mysteries if there's these things that exist that we don't really understand, and but what people end up doing, they try to talk about them and act as if we sort of kind of understand it, sort of, and the parts that we don't really get, well, it's because it's a mystery. But that's not the biblical way of understanding the things that we don't know. Now, of course, there's things we don't know because we have not investigated enough. We need to ask the right questions. There's so many things we could be learning if only we'd take the time to learn them. But there are other things that God has not revealed. And we should be as keen to accept that God has not revealed certain things as much as being keen for the things that he has revealed. So that's why it's very difficult to take the what God has revealed in Scripture and turn it into a comprehensive philosophy, because we don't have everything we need to fully understand everything that there might be to understand. God has purposely kept back certain things because we don't need to know them. Don't confuse that with religious teachers that keep knowledge back from people, or they cover up their own ignorance and say, well, that's too hard to understand. I'm talking about the real things that we can't understand because God has not revealed them. What those things are, I don't really know. Okay, conditions of the covenant. And so living by the covenant leads to blessings. And blessings, remember, blessing is being filled with the potential for life. So life is derived by keeping this covenant. Deuteronomy 28, verses 1 to 2. And if you faithfully obey the voice of the Lord your God, Moses is saying to the people of Israel, being careful to do all his commandments that I command you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you, overtaken by blessing. That's wonderful. If you obey the voice of the Lord your God. And then it explains some of the blessings. And mainly it's health, it's prosperity, it's life, it's having lots of kids, it's having big, like lots of flocks. You know what I mean? Lots of sheep and goats and so on. It talks about lending to other nations and not having to borrow. That's one of the many blessings that are told the people of Israel if they would live according to what God says in this covenant. But if they don't listen, then there's curses. Deuteronomy 28, verse 15. But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord your God, or be careful to do all his commandments and his statutes that I command you today, then all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you. And then there's a long description about the sickness and death that would happen, and the long list of terrible things that will occur if the people of Israel would forsake the covenant. And before I say what's at the end of the list, failure to keep the covenant is not that there's this long list of commandments, and if you mess up on one little commandment, you're out. That is not the essence of what God reveals in the books of Moses. Failure to keep the commandment failure to keep the covenant is rejecting the covenant. And the way the covenant is primarily rejected is by turning to other gods. God is so patient in his word with the various ways the people of Israel mess up, but it's the persistence to turn away from God and ignore him and turn to other gods. That's the thing that got the people of Israel into trouble, and that's the very thing that gets all people into trouble every time, the turning to false gods. And so if that happens, then the curses would follow, and the greatest of all the curses is being taken over by foreign powers, being dominated by foreigners and being exiled. And of course, that is what ends up happening to the people of Israel, and we'll be looking at that many sessions from this one. So the blessings and the curses are given, and then the Sinai covenant actually anticipates failure. Not very encouraging. Deuteronomy 29, verses 2 to 4. And Moses summoned all Israel and said to them, you have seen all that the Lord did before your eyes in the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his servants and to all his land, the great trials that your eyes saw, the signs and those great wonders. But to this day, after all those 40 years, the second generation, they're getting ready to go into the promised land. But to this day, the Lord has not given you a heart to understand, or eyes to see, or ears to hear. And then Moses actually recites this song that the people were to memorize and sing, which basically is saying, we're going to fail, we're going to fail, we're going to fail. Remember, Israel, the solution, also suffers from the same sin problem of all nations. There's no way they could have succeeded, which is one of the functions of the Sinai covenant. But it also anticipates restoration. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 1 to 3. And we're almost done. I've gone a little over time. We're going to wrap up in a few minutes. And when all these things have come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I've set before you, Moses is speaking, God is speaking through Moses, and you call them to mind because all the nations where the Lord your God has driven, I'm sorry, I got a little lost. I'm going to start again. When all these things come upon you, the blessing and the curse, which I've set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice in all that I command you today with all your heart, with all your soul, then the Lord your God will restore your fortunes and have mercy on you, and he will gather you again from all the peoples where the Lord your God has scattered you. So built into the covenant that predicts failure is an anticipation of restoration. Let's look at one more, and this is where we're going to end. Continuing on this theme of anticipates restoration, Leviticus 26, verses 40 through 42. But if they confess their iniquity and the iniquity of their fathers in their treachery that they committed against me, and also in walking contrary to me, so that I walked contrary to them, and brought them into the land of their enemies, if then their uncircumcised heart is humbled, and they make amends for their iniquity, then I will remember my covenant with Jacob, and I will remember my covenant with Isaac, and my covenant with Abraham, and I will remember the land. So, built into the Sinai covenant is this anticipation of restoration following Israel's failure. And note that the basis of the restoration isn't the Sinai covenant itself, but the previous covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And here they're listed. This might be the only time they're ever listed in reverse order: Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham. And this idea of being drawn back to the beginning, where God made this unconditional promise to Abraham and his descendants, that they would be a blessing to the nations, they'd be a great nation, and God would give them this land. These promises, they all came hundreds of years before the Sinai covenant was given, a covenant that was conditional upon how the people lived. But if they break that covenant, should they return to the Lord, they can come back. Why? Because of the previous covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And note that as part of that unconditional promise is the remembering of the land. The Bible doesn't go off and promise an detached, ethereal, non-earthly existence. The Bible, I'm going to jump way ahead in the Old Testament story. The people will learn that God anticipates a new heaven and a new earth when he restores all things, not just a new heaven, but also a new earth. And that earthly reality, which we are anticipating, is rooted in the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so that brings us to our Q&A, and I will invite Daniel back. I could see, let me turn off the screen share. Let's see. I had Daniel here a second ago. Let's see here. And there we go. That's what I wanted to do last week, have us both on screen.
Thanks, Dad. Dad, thanks so much for drawing on your years of biblical study and time preparing. I want to invite everybody, I'm looking at you, everyone, to ask your questions. So please put your questions in the question bar. I also want to acknowledge that almost 30 people share their favorite drink, but almost everybody of that 30 wrote it to panelists instead of to, you can select to send it to everybody. So it was really nice for me to get to know you a little bit more. But next week, when you are writing the chat bar, whatever question we ask, please feel free to select not just the panelists to see your answers, but everybody.
And by the way, Daniel, everybody out there, Daniel and I were talking about this earlier. I don't know if you've checked it. It's possible it's not set that they can
A couple people shared it with everybody. Renat, for
check. Okay,
example.
thanks.
Renat, for
You're
example.
on the ball, Daniel.
Still put a question.
That's why you've got this job, Daniel.
Thanks, Dad. And I'm your son. But hey, please feel free to ask questions, everybody. Sue from Pittsburgh asks this question. She says, do you think Moses really wandered for 40 years? Or is this just referring to a long time? The desert wasn't really that big, was it? And what about the following 38 years? Was it actually 38?
Well, it says that they did. I don't have any reason to believe that it was much shorter. Is it exactly 40? This is one of the things scholars like to chit chat about, and that is, are the numbers as precise as people in the 21st century use them? As if people who report things today get things that accurate. That's another story. But we tend to use numbers. When we use a number, we tend to think that that's very, very, very precise. It's possible that 40 years was an expression for a longish period of time, more than a month, but not that much more. It can mean that, or it is the actual 40 years. And in the person's question, could they, almost like, is it reasonable to believe that they could have wandered for that long? The answer is absolutely yes, because they were following the pillar of cloud and fire. And it says in the book of, pretty sure it's Numbers, Numbers or Exodus, that it says that the people would stay, they could stay a day or two or a couple of years in one place until the cloud moved. And so God was guiding them around here and there in the wilderness for his own purposes. And so, no, it didn't really matter how small or large the area was. God was guiding them, and they were traveling on his timetable.
Thanks, Dad. Joanne asks, so does the initial covenant with Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham belong to Gentiles who have accepted Messiah?
Can you repeat that again?
I'd be honored. Does the initial covenant with Jacob, Isaac, and Abraham belong to Gentiles who have accepted Messiah?
Yes and no. The Romans 11 is where you want to go to see Paul's magnificent three-dimensional illustration of that. He speaks about the grafting in. And so there are elements of what God had promised and given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their descendants that were always intended for all people. In fact, the reason for the chosenness of the people of Israel, in a sense, was not for ourselves. It was for the nations, but for ourselves too. But Abraham was called to be a blessing for the nations. So he was chosen for that purpose, not for self, but for others. But there were elements of the promise, especially the land, that were particular to the people. Even the fact of being the people who carried the promise, that's unique. And so Israel doesn't, as the nations are grafted in to the plans and purposes of God, which is how I like to refer to it, that doesn't blur out the original branches. The original branches retain their unique, I want to say nature. Do you have a better word for me? Their unique identity. Their unique identity in the overall plan of God. So on one hand, there's a great intimate sharing and equality. On the other hand, there is diversity. And then that diversity is not just about the people of Israel. It also emphasizes that the other nations possess their own diversity that becomes redeemed when they become part of the plans and purposes of God as revealed to Abraham and the others.
Thanks, Dad. The next question comes from Ted and Marg. They ask, was God seeing people under the age of 20 less responsible, and so they could enter the promised land?
Less responsible. Forgive me, Ted and Mark, but I hear a little bit of a loaded question. It's very difficult for me not to be thinking of it when I try to formulate this answer. And it's the concept of age of accountability that people talk about that has to do with um, our eternal destiny based upon our personal faith in the Messiah, and the question of what happened, does that only matter after a particular age of accountability, whatever that age might be? And then we can go to this story and your question and say, well, maybe 20 is that age. The secret things belong to the Lord, and the revealed things belong to us and our children that we might do them. I I really don't know. I think clearly, uh, on the practical level, there um, God recognizes the maturity of people. And so that children don't bear the same responsibility in life as adults do. The children were not to go off to war until a certain age. You weren't to serve as a priest if you were part of the priestly clan until a certain age. And then after a certain age, you needed to retire. So God recognizes some of these things. But what that might mean in terms of personal accountability before God, I really don't know.
I'd like to ask a follow-up question. Yeah, I think that question has to do with why the generation that was able to enter, not enter. But perhaps some are wondering, they know that a lot of Jewish boys have a bar mitzvah when they're 13, and that's when they're now responsible under the law. Is there any indication in the Bible that bar mitzvah is actually a biblical concept?
So, as quickly as I can. So, the term bar mitzvah means son of the commandment, and mitzvah means commandment. Bar is the Aramaic for son, and when it's a girl, which is a more recent innovation of that custom, it's bat mitzvah, daughter of the covenant. In Jewish tradition, when a child reaches the age of 13, it used to be 12 for girls. Some of the ways that customs have developed have a lot to do with the ceremony, but actually, the ceremony is a recognition of when the child becomes responsible for their own sins. That's how it's thought of in Judaism. So up until that age, the father is responsible for the sins of the child. Also, what happens at that age, they're now allowed to be part of what's called a minyan. And a minyan is what's the word for it? A quorum, like a religious quorum, the number of people you need before you could have a public service. People pray in private, but a public service, you need at least 10. It used to be 10 men. But now in some Jewish branches, as Jewish denominations are called, women are allowed to make up that number. But all these things are customs and traditions. We do not, it's hard to know when the custom of bar mitzvah happened. My understanding is it used to be at a much older age than 13, and then at some point it got pushed to a younger age. But there's nothing in the Bible to suggest that that custom doesn't seem to be rooted in the Bible. And I know some people talk about when Jesus was 12, he had this interaction with the teachers in the temple, and some people even say that was his bar mitzvah. It couldn't have been because the custom wasn't around at that time, and there's no reference in the New Testament in the context of that that's what was really going on.
Thanks, Dad. Mark asks a question. It ends with a question mark, but you might just be invited to comment. Mark says, I still marvel at the misjudgment of Aaron when he made an idol for a demanding, grumpy people and was then moved into an honored place of priest for the nation, question mark, question mark, question mark.
Well, Mark, if anything, that means there's hope for me and you. And I know this is like that scene is one of the most horrific incidences in the entire Bible. And it makes us go, what in the world is going on here? And then including how Moses confronts Aaron, like, what are you doing? And he said, "Well, I got all this gold, threw it into the fire, and out popped these two cows. There was a pair of them, it seems, and it's just clearly a cover up, and it almost sounds silly, and it would be funny if it wasn't horribly tragic. And then what do you do with the fact that God then takes Aaron and makes him the first chief or high priest? Well, part of the question is, I don't really know. On the other hand, we see what God can do with even, never mind broken, but evil human beings. Now, there's no sense that following that horrific episode, that Aaron kept like as if he was scheming on the side and having these evil parties, and he was the high priest anyway. It does seem that he got his act together. And there are issues later on. There's a story in First Samuel about there's Eli, the chief priest at that time, and his sons, and the evil things that they were doing, and then they were punished for it. And we see it over and over again. You know, Moses did wrong, and David did wrong, and there is a room in God's heart for forgiveness and restoration. And again, without it, and I was, trying to be a little funny at the beginning, without it, there would be no hope for any of us. None of this in any way, what's the word I'm looking for? It does not forgive. It doesn't justify. Thank you. It doesn't justify what people have done. God's forgiveness, God's leniency never justifies the wrong. In fact, it elevates his patience and his mercy and calls us to get our act together sooner than later.
Thanks, Dad. We appreciate that. Derek asks this question. Exodus 2:24 says, God heard their groaning, and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. Exodus says God remembered. Does this mean he also forgot?
Yeah. So the use of the verb to remember in the scriptures often means bring to remembrance. And having raised 10 children, I've often had to deal with we'll call it a reason, not an excuse, of I forgot. And, maybe Daniel could share about some of the times when he said, I forgot. And did he really forget? Or how does that work? I'm a human being too. And there's many things that we forget that really we shouldn't have forgotten. And so that kind of forget. There's no sense in which God had done what we claim that we do, which is, oops, that slipped my mind. That's why I didn't do it. It's talking about bringing something to remembrance, something that he had promised, and now he's acting upon. That's what the expression means in that context.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I hope I didn't bring back some bad memories.
No, I forgot any bad memories. Yeah, I, I, I feel like a parent who promises a child that on their 16th birthday they will take them to get their license to drive. That it's the day of the kid's 16th birthday, and the parent comes and says, "I remember. I am here to take you." It doesn't mean they've forgotten, but that they're staying true to who they are.
Right.
Or if he says, "I remember you turned 16," they're saying it's this expression of that consistency. I think it's not an expression that they forgot that the kid was going to turn 16.
And yeah. Oh, I'm so glad I remembered.
Yeah.
Sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Emmanuel from Langley, BC, says it's interesting to see the patriarchs mentioned in reverse order, something you mentioned, Dad. Would this indicate that Ishmael and Esau are not completely excluded from the covenant?
I'm not sure how the reverse order plays a part in that, but it's pretty clear that they are excluded from the covenant. They're not excluded from blessing from God. They and their descendants have access to the goodness of God in their lives and blessing, but they are not part of the covenant. Well, let's call it the covenantal program of God. They are outside of the covenantal program. Remember, everybody can be part of the covenantal program through the coming of the Messiah and the blessings that are for all the nations are available to all nations,
Mm.
even though their story is different.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, that you mentioned about manna, like bread only living versus the alternative. Can you expand just a little bit on just some practical? Can you go a little further into that? And what are some maybe a practical example of how we do bread only living versus Word of God living?
Well, the wonderful explanation of this is Matthew chapter 6, when the greater than Moses, the greatest rabbi of all, the long awaited prophet, the Messiah, expounds Torah in the Sermon on the Mount. And he talks about how we as children of God don't shouldn't be running after what and worrying about what we should eat, what we should wear, and so on, but that our focus should be on God's rule, His kingdom, and His righteousness, that which He says is right. And so it's a situation where He's saying, God's going to take care of your material needs. You just keep focused on what God is calling you to do, and God will take care of the rest. And so that's very different from how most of us live. And of course, those of us that theoretically believe this still struggle with it. So the worry about our bank account, the worry about our pension or not pension, our moods going up and down with the state of the stock market. If we're worried in this COVID time about what's going to happen with the economy, worried about it, and we're so focused on the savings we're going to lose and the businesses we're going to lose. God was the same before COVID, during COVID, and will be the same after COVID, and the same God who's promised to provide for us so that we could focus on Him and His will and not on the stuff of life. He will take care of us, and so that is the focus. And so, you know, you've seen for yourself and how we've lived and crisscrossed this country over decades, seeking to follow what the Lord was calling us to do, and trying our best not to make money the focus and material need the focus, but God's will the focus. I would never say we've done this perfectly, and I know I've done it actually with a lot of anxiety, but that has been my heart to do. I want to live by every word that comes from the mouth of God and not by bread alone.
Mm. I just want to throw in there as my dad's son that I think one of the ways for my siblings, of 9 siblings, certainly for myself, that I've seen the reality of God in this world, like has been through by seeing my parents be trying to live uh, a life trusting God, and being willing to follow God and seek to obey Him, even when it might cause risk and vulnerability financially, whatever bread represents. And just seeing them being willing to trust God made them not just be teaching me about God, but I got to see that they believed the things they taught, and it gave us authority to what they said when they taught us about God. I want to encourage people to follow their example. The
I'd like
next,
to. I want to share one of my favorite stories on this topic because I want to, and that is, so I came from a family background where it was my parents always worried about money. They always argued about money, and I grew up with all this anxiety over what we didn't have and what we couldn't do because of the money. And so then at 19, I come to believe in really believe in God for the first time, and I invite Jesus to to take control of my life, and I begin to learn His way of living, including Matthew chapter 6. And that's how we sought to live, which was pretty wild and also helped with. So when I came to believe in Jesus, it was just me and my mother at home, and we were on welfare. And so we really didn't have. And I had to learn that I could do whatever God was calling me to do, whether there was money in the bank for it or not. And so years later, we start having children, and the fellowship we were going to was going to have a weekend camp, and I can't remember if it was a family camp or a kids camp. And when our kids were this age, we would pray for each of them before they went to sleep. And I was about to pray for one of our daughters, and she said that she really wanted us to pray that they could go to this camp. And we were really struggling financially at that point. And I said, I don't know if you're going to be able to because we don't have the money. And she said, I think she was 12 years old at the time. She said, when did that ever stop us before? And I thought, look what God has done from my background, where it was always you can't, you can't, you can't, to this idea that anything is possible if God is in it, which is the truth. You muted by some accident.
Thanks, Dad. Uh,
My pleasure.
yeah, just if we can stay here for a second. Yeah, I was a kid when those stories happened. I'm now an adult, and I've had to make some tough decisions that impacted my own career and stuff. Now as a married man, and it's super scary. And I recently have found myself unemployed because of some of those decisions. And just being able, like, my eyes fill with tears as my dad's telling the story, because you just being able to, yeah, face like those moments in life that are, where you have the choice to do what you believe is the godly thing or not. um yeah, I mean, I'm sure it's scary as a single person too, but also there's dependence, and it's super frightening to try to do the right thing. But part of my ability to make some decisions that I like, yeah, to make the tough decision is being able to just look back at my parents' willingness to, like, to have shown us by their own courageous, vulnerable decisions that we can trust God and seek to do the right thing, even when it means, even when there's scary financial implications. And so, yeah, I don't know if this is encouraging to anybody else, but Dad, it's just really precious to hear you reflect on, on that. So yeah, I think a lot of parents want to give their kids, want to shield their children from any financial vulnerability, but maybe sometimes they're trying to shield people from stuff, shield their kids from stuff. We might be actually shielding them from seeing the reality of how God will provide and how God will come through. And so, if in any way, if this can encourage people to really step out, maybe step into the unknown, or step into that courageous, vulnerable decision, perhaps. And yeah, I don't know if that makes sense, but anyways, I got the feels as you speak, Dad. I got the feels. Thank you for being an example to me of integrity. That's it's 8:30, so there's a couple more questions. My dad will do his best to get back to people directly.
Yeah, so Daniel, I'm going to interrupt you. So somebody pointed out that we forgot to open in prayer. And
Mm,
I think it would be really appropriate, given what we just talked about. I would love to pray for us all on this issue in particular. And I'm sure there's some people out there, whether you're watching live or watching it after on YouTube, that you are really struggling. And you might even be struggling with a decision that has financial ramifications right now, and you need to know what God is saying. And I do want to encourage you that what God said through Moses is still true today, that we don't live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. And that's the most important thing, is that we hear God. I know that's not always easy to come by, but God is more, if I use the word anxious, God's more anxious to speak to us than we are to hear him. Uh, he wants to speak to us. He wants to guide us, but we need to trust him. So how about I'll pray, and then I'll let you sign off. And as usual, I will look at all the questions that are remaining, and I'll do my best to answer them as quickly as I can. And do send other questions to me by email. And again, as I can, I will answer you. Our Father, again, we thank you for your word. What a wonder that we could have this gift, that we have not been left to ourselves to figure all this out. Even with your word, it's confusing, Lord, but we're not alone. Because of what your Son has done, we have your Spirit who leads us into all truth. But we need not only to have your wisdom that you promised to give us, but a willing heart to obey what you say. Lord, show us how we've kind of fudged in that, want to do God's will, and we've all failed in that area. I have failed in that area, Lord. I have acted in fear and not in faith. God, help us all. We thank you that we stand today on a covenant, established by the Messiah's blood. And that however we've blown it in the past, we could start afresh with you right now. And so for all of us, Lord, and especially for those who might be struggling financially, the future from our perspective does not look bright. For those who have to make a decision very soon that might affect them and their loved ones financially, we ask you to grant your wisdom, grant your help, and help us all to hear you clearly like never before, and give us the trust and the courage to obey what you're saying to us. And Lord, if there's anyone who honestly feels that you have let them down through the years, where they stepped out, they believed in all these things before, and they stepped out and it did not go well, would you speak to those people especially and help them to debrief with you? Just like Moses would constantly debrief with you, rather than going by what he thought, he would go back to you. May you speak into those situations of the past where people trusted you and it seemed that you let them down. Lord, shine your light on all of us tonight. We look to you. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Well, Dad, thank you so much again for sharing both from the scriptures and also vulnerably from your own life examples. Everyone, thank you for tuning in from all over. Look forward to seeing you next week and hearing more from my dad as he takes us into is the Torah relevant for today. I believe next week is going to be diving into, is the Torah relevant for today? A lot of our people's lack of grappling with and understanding the Torah's relevancy find it very difficult to read through the first few books of the scriptures, especially the parts that have laws and all this. How do we mind that for hearing God speak to us through His Word? We desperately need to. So I look forward to seeing you next week, and my dad and I are praying God's blessing on you in all that you are walking through. So have a great night, and see you next Wednesday at